In the ruins of post-war Germany, hunger spoke louder than politics. Children, some barely 12, wandered through bombed-out
It's all right.
cities,
You're
still
safe
wearing
now.
the tattered
I'm here.
uniforms of the Hitler Youth. They had fought for a dream they didn't understand, fired rifles taller than their own bodies, and watched their families vanish in smoke. But when the guns fell silent, they found something they never expected: compassion from the very men they'd been taught to hate. American soldiers, many just a few years older than these boys, began feeding them, sheltering them, even teaching them to read again. The children started calling them Father, and when the nurses and Red Cross women from the Allied camps cradled them, they whispered Mother. This story isn't about victory or defeat. It's about what happens after the war ends, when the human heart tries to rebuild what the bombs destroyed. In this narrative, we uncover how enemy soldiers became parents to their former foes, and how those moments of fragile kindness changed both nations forever. Berlin had become a graveyard of concrete and steel. In the spring of 1945, the city lay broken beneath a gray sky that seemed to mourn alongside its people. Entire blocks had been reduced to rubble, leaving only skeletal frames of what once were homes, schools, churches. The air tasted of ash and decay. In the streets, shadows moved slowly, cautiously, ghosts of a nation that had believed itself invincible. Among these shadows were children. Boys who should have been playing in schoolyards now picked through debris, searching for scraps of food, bits of metal to trade. Anything to survive another day. Their clothes hung loose on their thin frames. Their eyes, once bright with the fervor of youth indoctrination, now reflected only emptiness and confusion. Some still wore the remnants of Hitler Youth uniforms, the eagle and swastika patches faded and torn, symbols of a regime that had collapsed around them like the buildings they slept in. These were not ordinary children. They had been trained to fight, to hate, to die for a cause they barely comprehended. At 10, 11, 12 years old, they had stood in formation, raised their right arms in salute, and pledged their lives to a madman's vision. They had distributed propaganda leaflets, collected scrap metal for the war effort, and in the final desperate months, some had been handed rifles and sent to defend bridges and checkpoints against the advancing Allied forces. They were soldiers without childhood, believers without understanding. Now, with their Führer dead and their nation defeated, they were simply lost. Many had no parents to return to. Mothers killed in the bombing raids, fathers missing on the Eastern Front or dead in the ruins of Berlin itself. The children wandered in small packs, sleeping in basements, attics, anywhere that offered shelter from the cold. They trusted no one, feared everyone, and clung to the only identity they had ever known, even as it crumbled beneath them. In Hamburg, the destruction was equally complete. The firestorm of 1943 had turned entire neighborhoods into charcoal. 3 years later, survivors still navigated streets where the heat had been so intense that the asphalt had melted and hardened into black waves. Among the ruins, a group of boys had formed a kind of family. The oldest was 15, the youngest barely 9. They shared whatever they found, protected each other from desperate adults, and kept a small fire burning in the shell of what used to be a bakery. They rarely spoke about the war. What was there to say? They had sung songs about glory and sacrifice, had believed their teachers when they said Germany would rule for 1,000 years. They had cheered as the newsreels showed victories, had proudly worn their uniforms to rallies where thousands gathered under banners and torches. And then, suddenly, it was over. The songs meant nothing. The promises were lies. The world they had known had ended, and no one had prepared them for what came after. In Cologne, the cathedral still stood, a miracle of stone amid the devastation. But the city around it was a maze of broken walls and empty windows. Here, children hid in the shadows, watching the American soldiers who had begun to arrive in their trucks and jeeps. The children had been taught that these men were devils, that they would destroy everything German, that death was preferable to surrender. But the children were also starving, and the Americans had food. It was a strange, tense coexistence. The soldiers moved through the streets, securing buildings, clearing rubble, setting up checkpoints. The children watched from a distance, hunger gnawing at their bellies, pride keeping them at bay. Some still believed that somehow, impossibly, Germany would rise again. Others simply didn't know what to believe anymore. They existed in a fog of trauma and confusion, their young minds struggling to reconcile what they had been taught with what they now saw. At night, they huddled together for warmth, sharing stories of before the bombs, before the hunger, before the world turned to ash. They spoke of mothers who used to bake bread, of fathers who hoisted them onto their shoulders, of Christmas mornings and summer holidays by the Baltic Sea. But these memories felt distant, almost unreal, like tales from someone else's life. The present was cold, hard, and cruel. Survival was the only goal. Everything else was a luxury they could no longer afford. The American forces began their occupation with efficiency and caution. They had been warned about resistance, about fanatics who might continue fighting even after the surrender. They established military government headquarters in the least damaged buildings, set up supply depots, and started the enormous task of managing a defeated nation. The orders were clear: maintain security, prevent disease, and prepare for reconstruction. But nothing in the orders prepared them for the children. Lieutenant Daniel Morrison first encountered them on a wet April morning. He was conducting an inspection of a warehouse near the American sector boundary when he heard a noise from inside. Drawing his pistol, he pushed open the door and found himself face to face with 6 boys, none older than 13, their hands full of canned goods from the American supplies. They froze, staring at him with wide, terrified eyes. Morrison could have arrested them, turned them over to the military police, followed protocol. Instead, he lowered his weapon and studied their faces. He saw not enemies, but children, thin children with hollow cheeks and desperate eyes. Children who looked remarkably like his younger brother back in Ohio, who would be about the same age as the tallest boy now standing before him. He holstered his pistol and spoke slowly in his limited German. The boys didn't move. One of them, a blond child with a scar across his forehead, still clutched 2 cans of beans as if they were precious jewels. Morrison reached into his pack and pulled out a chocolate bar, one of several his mother had sent from home. He broke it into pieces and held them out. The boys hesitated. This was the enemy. They had been told Americans would torture them, imprison them, maybe worse. But the chocolate was real, and their hunger was overwhelming. The smallest boy took a step forward, then another. He reached out, grabbed a piece, and stuffed it into his mouth. The others followed, cautiously at first. Then, with increasing desperation, Morrison watched them devour the chocolate, and something shifted inside him. These weren't soldiers. They were victims. That afternoon, Morrison spoke with his commanding officer about what he had seen. The response was pragmatic. The children were a problem that wouldn't go away. They were everywhere, thousands of them, orphaned or abandoned, living in the ruins. If the Americans didn't help them, they would turn to crime, to the black market, or worse. The decision was made to establish feeding stations, to provide basic medical care, to separate the youngest from the growing chaos of post-war Germany. But many soldiers resisted the idea. These were German children, sons of the enemy, raised on hatred and lies. Why should American resources go to feed them when American families back home were still rationing sugar and butter? The debate raged in mess halls and barracks. Some argued for compassion, others for justice. In the end, it was the individual actions of men like Morrison that made the difference. He returned to the warehouse the next day with bread, cheese, and powdered milk. The boys were there, waiting. Over the following weeks, Morrison visited them regularly, bringing food and trying to communicate despite the language barrier. He learned their names. The blond boy with the scar was called Peter. The youngest was Friedrich. They began to trust him, slowly, carefully, like wild animals learning that a particular human meant no harm. Other soldiers followed Morrison's example. Corporal James Walker, a young man from a small town in Texas, encountered a group of children scavenging near the American motor pool. Instead of chasing them away, he started leaving food where they could find it. He watched from a distance as they took it, saw how carefully they divided everything equally, how the older ones made sure the younger ones ate first. It reminded him of how his own family had survived the Depression, everyone looking out for everyone else. One evening, Walker found a boy collapsed near the fence, too weak from hunger to run. The child couldn't have been more than 13, his Hitler Youth uniform hanging on his skeletal frame like a costume several sizes too large. Walker carried him to the camp medic, staying with him through the night as the boy drifted in and out of consciousness, murmuring words in German that Walker couldn't understand. The boy's name was Emil. He had been separated from his mother during a bombing raid, had watched his apartment building collapse with her inside. For months, he had survived alone, eating whatever he could find, sleeping wherever seemed safe. The Hitler Youth had given him a sense of belonging, a purpose, something to believe in when everything else had fallen apart. Now even that was gone, and he was utterly, completely alone. Walker sat beside Emil's bed in the makeshift hospital tent, watching the boy's chest rise and fall with each labored breath. The medic said he would survive, but barely. Another few days without food, and there would have been nothing anyone could do. Walker thought about his own younger brother, safe at home in Texas, probably complaining about having to do his homework or clean his room. This boy had no home, no family, no future that anyone could see. When Emil woke, he flinched away from Walker, pressing himself against the wall, fear bright in his eyes. Walker raised his hands slowly, showing he meant no harm. He had brought some of his own rations, crackers, a bit of canned meat, an apple he had been saving. He placed them on the small table beside the bed and stepped back. Emil stared at the food, then at Walker, trying to understand. Why was the enemy feeding him? Over the following days, Walker returned to check on Emil. He brought more food, a blanket, a book with pictures. He didn't speak much, just sat nearby, letting the boy grow accustomed to his presence. Gradually, Emil began to relax. He ate the food Walker brought, accepted the blanket, even looked at the pictures in the book. And slowly, tentatively, a connection formed between them. Something neither could fully explain. The children of post-war Germany lived in a liminal space between hope and despair. They wandered through cities that had become alien landscapes, where familiar streets had vanished beneath rubble and nothing remained as it had been. Hunger was their constant companion, a hollow ache that never quite went away. Even when they managed to find something to eat, they learned to move quietly, to avoid attention, to disappear into shadows when adults approached. Many still carried the psychological scars of their indoctrination. They had been raised to believe in racial superiority, in the righteousness of conquest, in the necessity of absolute obedience. The Hitler Youth had not just been a club or an organization, it had been their entire world. They had marched in formation, sung anthems about sacrifice and glory, competed for badges and ranks. They had informed on neighbors, collected donations for the war effort, and in the final months, trained with weapons that seemed too large for their small hands. The collapse of everything they had believed left them adrift. Some clung to fragments of the old ideology, insisting to each other that Germany hadn't really lost, that the Führer had a secret plan, that victory was still possible. Others rejected it all, feeling betrayed and angry at the adults who had led them into catastrophe. Most simply felt confused, unable to reconcile the propaganda they had been fed with the reality they now faced. In Frankfurt, a group of boys maintained a kind of military discipline in their makeshift shelter. They assigned watch duties, rationed their meager supplies, and maintained a hierarchy based on age and former Hitler Youth rank. They drilled each morning, marching in formation through the rubble, as if keeping up appearances would somehow restore order to their shattered world. When American soldiers tried to approach with offers of food, the boys refused, shouting defiance in German. their young voices cracking with anger and fear. But hunger eventually breaks even the strongest resistance. One by one, the boys began to accept the food, to approach the American distribution centers, to stand in line with the other desperate civilians. The shame was overwhelming. They had been taught that accepting help from the enemy was the ultimate betrayal. Yet their bodies demanded sustenance, and pride couldn't fill empty stomachs. They ate the American bread and powdered eggs, and hated themselves for it. In Munich, the situation was similar. Children organized themselves into gangs, defending territories among the ruins, trading information and goods in the emerging black market. Some turned to theft, breaking into American supply depots, stealing from other survivors. Violence was common. Trust was rare. The world had become a harsh, unforgiving place where only the clever and ruthless survived. Yet even in this environment, moments of unexpected kindness emerged. An American chaplain named Father Timothy O'Brien began visiting the ruins where children were known to hide. He brought no guards, no weapons, only food and blankets. He spoke simple German phrases, offering help without conditions. The children were suspicious at first, watching him from hiding places, waiting for the trap. But Father O'Brien kept coming back, day after day, leaving supplies and asking nothing in return. Eventually, a few children began to approach him. They asked questions. Why was he helping them? What did he want? O'Brien's answer was always the same. Because they needed help, and because it was the right thing to do. The concept seemed foreign to them, almost incomprehensible. In their experience, everything came with conditions, with demands, with consequences. Nothing was given freely. But O'Brien's actions slowly, gradually, began to change their understanding. The winter of 1945 into 1946 was brutal. Temperatures dropped below freezing for weeks at a time, and the children suffered terribly. They huddled in basements and attics, burning whatever they could find for warmth. Broken furniture, books, even pieces of their own clothing. Frostbite was common. Illness spread quickly through their weakened bodies. Many died quietly in the night, their small forms found stiff and cold when morning came. The American military authorities, confronted with the scale of the humanitarian crisis, expanded their relief efforts. More feeding stations opened. Medical teams were dispatched to treat the sick and injured. Plans were drawn up for orphanages and displaced persons camps, but the need far exceeded the resources available, and countless children continued to fall through the cracks, invisible and forgotten in the vast landscape of suffering. James Walker continued to visit Emil regularly. The boy had recovered enough to leave the hospital tent, but he had nowhere to go. Walker managed to get permission for Emil to stay in a section of the camp designated for civilian workers and their families. It wasn't much, just a cot in a shared room. But it was warm and safe. And Emil had regular meals for the first time in months. A strange bond developed between them. Walker would stop by after his duties, and Emil would be waiting. They couldn't communicate much through words, their languages forming a barrier that seemed insurmountable at first. But Walker brought pictures from home, photographs of his family, his town, the wide Texas sky. He pointed to his parents, his siblings, his dog. Emil studied these images with intense concentration, as if trying to understand what family was supposed to look like. One evening, Walker pointed to a photograph of his younger brother, a boy about Emil's age standing in front of a farmhouse, grinning at the camera. Then he pointed to Emil and then to himself, trying to convey a connection, a relationship. Emil stared at him, uncomprehending at first. Then, slowly, understanding dawned in his eyes. Walker was offering something more than food or shelter. He was offering belonging. Emil spoke a word in German, hesitantly, testing it out. Walker didn't understand, so Emil tried again, slower this time, and accompanied the word with a gesture, pointing to Walker and then to his own heart. Walker still didn't understand the specific word, but he understood the meaning in Emil's eyes, in his expression, in the way he held himself with a mixture of hope and fear. The boy was asking if this was real, If this connection between them meant something, if he could dare to believe that someone cared about him. Walker nodded, and without thinking about it, pulled Emil into a brief embrace. The boy stiffened at first, unused to affection, then relaxed, his thin arms coming up to return the hug. They stayed like that for a moment. A young American soldier and a German child, two people who should have been enemies, finding something human and necessary in each other's presence. The arrival of American nurses and Red Cross women brought a different kind of healing to post-war Germany. These women came with medical supplies and organizational skills, but also with something the children desperately needed: maternal compassion. Many were mothers themselves, with sons and daughters safely back in America. They looked at the German children and saw not the enemy, but kids who needed care. Eleanor Hayes was 38 years old, a widow from Pennsylvania whose own son had died in the Pacific Theater. She had joined the Red Cross partly to honor his memory, partly to do something useful with her grief. When she arrived in Germany in the summer of 1945, she expected to feel anger toward these people whose nation had started the war that killed her boy. Instead, confronted with rooms full of sick, starving children, she felt only pity. The conditions in the makeshift orphanages were appalling. Dozens of children crowded into spaces meant for half that number, sleeping on thin mattresses or bare floors, sharing a few blankets among them. Many were sick with tuberculosis, dysentery, pneumonia. Their small bodies bore the marks of malnutrition: swollen bellies, stick, thin limbs, dull hair, sores that wouldn't heal. They watched the adults with wary, suspicious eyes, expecting nothing good. Eleanor started with the basics. She organized cleaning schedules, established meal times, set up a system for distributing clothes and blankets. She brought order to chaos, creating routines that gave the children something to depend on. But more importantly, she brought kindness. She learned their names, asked about their stories, sat beside their beds when they were sick. She sang quiet songs while washing their faces and combing their matted hair. She held them when they cried, which was often. At first, the children didn't know how to respond to this treatment. They were used to harsh discipline, to orders barked and immediately obeyed, to the rigid structure of Hitler Youth training. Gentleness was unfamiliar, almost threatening. But Eleanor was patient. She moved slowly, spoke softly, never forced her attention on those who weren't ready. Gradually, the children began to accept her presence, to seek her out, to trust her. There was a little girl named Anna, maybe 7 years old, who hadn't spoken since she was found wandering alone near Stuttgart. No one knew what had happened to her family, what she had witnessed, why she had locked her voice away inside herself. She sat in corners, rocking slightly, staring at nothing. Eleanor would sit beside her, not speaking, just being present. She would offer Anna a doll, or a piece of bread, or simply her hand to hold. Anna never responded, but she also never pulled away. This continued for weeks. Eleanor came every day, sat with Anna, offered quiet companionship without expectation. Then one morning, as Eleanor was helping another child, she felt a small hand slip into hers. It was Anna, standing beside her, her face still expressionless but her fingers wrapped tightly around Eleanor's hand. Eleanor squeezed back gently and continued with her work. Anna now following her from bed to bed, a silent shadow. Days later, Eleanor was singing a lullaby, something her own mother had sung to her as a child. When she heard a small voice join in, Anna was humming along, barely audible, but unmistakably present. Eleanor kept singing, tears streaming down her face as the little girl found her voice again. It was a small miracle, one of many that occurred in those difficult months. Another nurse, Sarah Mitchell from Ohio, specialized in treating physical wounds, but found herself doing much more. She tended to infected cuts, set broken bones, dispensed precious antibiotics to fight off infections, but she also braided hair, told stories, played simple games with children too weak to stand. She became a constant, reliable presence in their uncertain world. The children began calling these women mother. It started with one child, then spread through the orphanages and camps. They didn't have a word that felt right for what these women were doing. The care they were providing, So they used the one word that meant safety and love. Mother. The women found it both heartbreaking and profoundly moving. These children who had lost so much were reaching out, trying to build new connections, to create family where biology had failed them. Not everyone approved of the growing bonds between American soldiers and German children. There were those who believed that any kindness shown to Germans, even child Germans, was a betrayal of the men who had died fighting them. Arguments broke out in barracks and mess halls. Some soldiers refused to participate in relief efforts, insisting that the Germans should suffer the consequences of their nation's actions. James Walker found himself in one such argument with a sergeant who had lost his brother at the Battle of the Bulge. The sergeant couldn't understand why Walker was wasting time and resources on Emil, on enemy spawn who would probably grow up to start another war. The confrontation grew heated, with other soldiers gathering around, taking sides. Walker tried to explain that Emil was just a child, that he hadn't started the war, that he was as much a victim as anyone. But the sergeant wouldn't listen. His grief and anger too deep, too raw. The argument ended with the sergeant demanding that Walker stop bringing Emil around the camp, stop using American supplies to feed him, stop pretending that some kind of friendship could exist across the divide of war. That night, Walker sat in his tent, torn between his orders, his loyalties, and his conscience. He thought about his own upbringing, about the values his parents had taught him. His father always said you judged a man by how he treated those who couldn't do anything for him in return. His mother read from the Bible every Sunday, passages about caring for the orphaned and the widow, about loving your enemy, about forgiveness. Emil appeared outside Walker's tent the next morning, having somehow slipped past the guards. The boy looked terrified, having heard about the argument, convinced that Walker would send him away. He stood there, small and vulnerable, his eyes pleading. Walker looked at him and made his decision. He took Emil's hand and led him to the mess hall, got him breakfast, and ate beside him. Let anyone who had a problem with it come find him. Lieutenant Morrison faced similar challenges. His commander supported the relief efforts in theory, but worried about the practical implications. Resources were limited. The occupation required order and discipline. Fraternization with civilians, especially former enemy civilians, could complicate matters. Morrison was told to maintain professional distance, to focus on his military duties, to leave the humanitarian work to designated relief organizations. But Morrison couldn't forget the faces of those boys in the warehouse, or the dozens of others he encountered in the following weeks. He couldn't ignore their need, their suffering, their humanity. So he found ways to work around the restrictions. He organized unofficial collection drives among his men, gathering spare rations, cigarettes for trading, clothes that no longer fit. He used his own leave time to help establish a makeshift school for orphaned children, teaching them basic English and arithmetic. His efforts didn't go unnoticed. Some superior officers quietly approved, turning a blind eye to activities that technically violated protocol. Others complained, filing reports about unauthorized use of military resources. Morrison walked a fine line, always one step away from disciplinary action, but unable to stop himself from helping. The children, for their part, began to change. The rigid indoctrination of the Hitler Youth gradually lost its hold, as they experienced a different kind of authority, one based on care rather than fear. They started to question what they had been taught, to see the Americans not as monsters but as men, flawed and complicated like anyone else. A group of boys who had been among the most resistant started attending Morrison's informal school. At first they came only for the hot meal provided afterward, sitting in the back with arms crossed, refusing to participate. But Morrison was patient. He taught them English words by pointing at objects, made learning a game rather than a chore, praised their efforts no matter how small. Slowly, they engaged. They started raising their hands, attempting pronunciation, even laughing at their mistakes. One boy in particular, a 14-year-old named Carl who had been a squad leader in the Hitler Youth, struggled with accepting help from Americans. His father had been a devoted Nazi Party member, had raised Carl to believe in racial superiority and national destiny. Even in defeat, Carl clung to these beliefs, certain that his father had been right about everything. Then Carl received news that his father had been identified among the dead, killed not by the Allies but by a Soviet shell during the Battle of Berlin. The news shattered something in Carl. He had built his entire identity around his father's ideology. And now his father was gone, leaving him with nothing but ashes and lies. He disappeared for several days, and when Morrison finally found him, the boy was barely conscious, having eaten almost nothing, drunk almost nothing, given up on living. Morrison carried Carl to the medical tent, stayed with him as the doctors worked to rehydrate him and restore his strength. As Carl slowly recovered, Morrison sat beside his bed and spoke to him about his own father, a factory worker in Chicago who had taught Morrison that being strong meant protecting those weaker than yourself, that real men admitted when they were wrong, that it was okay to change your mind when you learned something new. Carl listened, saying nothing, but something in Morrison's words reached him. When he was well enough to walk, Morrison took him to the orphanage and showed him children younger than himself who needed help. He asked Carl to assist with the daily routines, to use his leadership skills in a different way. At first, Carl refused. But gradually, watching the nurses and soldiers care for these children, he began to participate. He helped distribute food, organized games, even protected the smaller children from bullies. One day, Carl approached Morrison and spoke in halting English, words he had learned in the informal school. He said 2 words, "I'm sorry." Morrison put his hand on the boy's shoulder and replied, "I know. It's okay. We start again." And they did. As autumn arrived, the orphanages and camps became more established. The children had regular meals, medical care, even some education. The immediate crisis had passed, though the long-term problems remained enormous. Thousands of children still needed permanent homes, needed their trauma addressed, needed a future beyond mere survival. James, Walker, and Emil had developed their own daily routine. Walker would stop by after breakfast, and they would walk together through the camp, Walker teaching Emil English words, Emil teaching Walker German. They communicated in a mixture of both languages, supplemented by gestures and drawings. Emil began to smile, something he hadn't done in longer than he could remember. Walker received a letter from his mother back in Texas. She wanted to know about his experiences, about what Germany was like, about whether he was safe. Walker decided to read the letter to Emil, translating slowly so the boy could understand. When he reached the part where his mother mentioned his younger brother, how much she missed Walker and worried about him, Emil's eyes filled with tears. Walker realized that Emil hadn't heard from his own mother in over 2 years, hadn't known if she was alive or dead, had lived with that uncertainty crushing him every single day. He pulled Emil close, letting the boy cry against his shoulder, the kind of deep, wrenching sobs that come from a pain too large for words. When the tears finally subsided, Emil looked up at Walker and spoke in German, then in English, a single word, "Father." Walker felt something break and remake itself in his chest. He had never imagined himself as anyone's father, least of all to a German boy he'd met in the wreckage of war. But hearing Emil say that word, with such desperate hope in his voice, Walker couldn't deny the truth of it. Somehow, impossibly, they had become family. He started including Emil in his letters home, writing about the boy to his mother, his siblings, his friends. He described Emil's progress learning English, his growing confidence, his moments of laughter. Walker's mother wrote back immediately, enclosing a small package for Emil, a hand-knitted scarf in blue wool, a photograph of the family farm, and a note that said simply, "Welcome to our family." Walker translated the note for Emil, who held it as if it were made of gold. They began writing letters together, Walker helping Emil compose messages in English to send to Texas. Emil's handwriting was shaky, his spelling creative, but his meaning was clear. He thanked Walker's mother for the scarf, described his daily life, asked questions about Texas and America, and what it was like to have a real home. He signed the letters Emil Walker, trying on the possibility of belonging. The other soldiers noticed Walker's attachment to Emil, and it inspired some of them to form similar bonds with other children. Soon, several boys were regularly visiting the camp, helping with small tasks, learning English, becoming unofficial members of the unit. The commander allowed it, recognizing that it improved morale and gave his men a sense of purpose beyond military duties. Lieutenant Morrison's informal school grew into something more substantial. Local German women who spoke English volunteered to help teach. An abandoned school building was cleaned and repaired. Desks were salvaged from the rubble. Books arrived in care packages from churches and civic organizations in America. What had started as one officer teaching basic words to a handful of boys became a real school serving over 100 children. Morrison found himself becoming not just a teacher but a father figure to many of these students. They sought his advice, his approval, his presence. When one boy succeeded in reading an entire paragraph in English without mistakes, he ran to show Morrison first, beaming with pride. When another boy got into a fight with his bunkmates, Morrison was the one called to mediate, to listen to both sides, to dispense justice that was fair but kind. The Red Cross women continued their work as well, providing not just physical care but emotional support. Eleanor Hayes had become especially close to Anna, the little girl who had been silent for so long. Anna now followed Eleanor everywhere, talking constantly as if making up for lost time. She told stories about her parents, about her cat that had died in the bombing, about her fears and hopes and dreams. Eleanor listened to it all, giving the child something invaluable. Witness to her pain, validation of her experience, proof that her life mattered. Sarah Mitchell organized activities for the older girls, teaching them cooking, sewing, and basic nursing skills. She wanted them to have practical knowledge they could use to build lives for themselves. But more than that, she wanted them to feel capable, to know that they could survive and even thrive despite everything they had endured. She taught them that being strong didn't mean never crying. It meant crying and then getting up and continuing forward. The children began calling both the soldiers and the nurses by family names: Father Walker, Mother Eleanor, Uncle Daniel. These names started as tentative offerings, testing whether the adults would accept such intimacy. When the adults embraced the titles, responding with affection and commitment, the children bloomed. They had been starved for connection, for the simple assurance that someone cared whether they lived or died. Now they had that, and it changed everything. Christmas 1945 approached, and the Americans decided to celebrate with the children. They collected donations, scrounged supplies, called in favors. On Christmas Eve, the orphanage was transformed. A tree had been erected and decorated with handmade ornaments. Candles provided warm light. Tables groaned under the weight of a feast. Roasted meat, fresh bread, vegetables, fruits, and sweets. The children could hardly believe it. Many hadn't celebrated Christmas in years, the war having stolen even that simple joy from them. They sat at the tables, eyes wide, overwhelmed by the abundance before them. Walker sat beside Emil, who kept touching the food as if to verify it was real. Morrison carved the meat, serving generous portions to each child. Eleanor and Sarah moved through the room, making sure everyone had enough, that no child went without. After dinner, there were gifts, nothing elaborate, but meaningful. Warm socks, pencils and paper, simple toys, books. Each child received something chosen specifically for them, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. The American soldiers had pooled their money and creativity to make this happen, to give these children one night of normalcy, one memory of joy to carry into the uncertain future. Emil opened his package to find a baseball and glove. He had no idea what they were for, but Walker showed him, tossing the ball gently back and forth, teaching him to catch. Soon other children joined in, laughing as they fumbled with the strange American game, and the sound of that laughter echoed off the walls, a sound so rare and precious that several of the adults had to turn away, overcome with emotion. As the evening wound down, Eleanor gathered the youngest children around her and sang carols. Her voice was not trained, but it was warm and true. And the children leaned against her, some already falling asleep. Anna sat in her lap, thumb in mouth, completely content. Morrison played his harmonica, accompanying Eleanor, and soon others joined in, singing in English and German, the melodies blending together. Walker looked around the room at the children, at his fellow soldiers, at the nurses who had worked so hard to make this evening possible. He thought about how none of this should exist, how war was supposed to create only destruction and hatred. Yet here they were, enemy and victor, sitting together, sharing food and song, building something like family from the rubble of hatred. Emil tugged on his sleeve and spoke carefully in English. "Father, thank you." Walker pulled the boy close, this child who had become his son in every way that mattered, and replied, "You're welcome, son." In that moment, the war felt very far away, and the future, for once, didn't seem quite so dark. As 1946 progressed, the reality of the occupation settled into routine. The initial crisis had passed, but the work of rebuilding continued. The children in the orphanages and camps needed more than food and shelter. They needed education, counseling, hope for their futures. Plans were made to find them permanent homes, either with surviving relatives or through adoption. This prospect filled many children with fear. They had grown attached to their American fathers and mothers, had found stability and love in these unexpected relationships. The thought of losing that security was terrifying. Walker noticed Emil becoming withdrawn, anxious. When he finally got the boy to explain, Emil revealed that he was afraid of being sent away, of losing his new family. Walker hadn't thought that far ahead, hadn't considered what would happen when his unit eventually rotated home. The idea of leaving Emil behind was suddenly unbearable. He began making inquiries about adoption, about what it would take to bring Emil to America. The process was complicated, tangled in regulations and paperwork, requiring approvals from multiple authorities. But Walker was determined. He wrote letters, filled out forms, called in every favor he had. The other soldiers watched his efforts with interest. Some thought he was crazy, taking on such a massive responsibility for a child who wasn't his own. Others understood completely, having formed their own attachments to the children they had helped. Morrison was one of those who understood. He had been considering similar options for Carl, who had transformed from a rigid young fanatic into a thoughtful, caring teenager under Morrison's guidance. The nurses faced different challenges. They couldn't adopt all the children they cared for, much as they might have wished to. Instead, they focused on preparing the children for whatever future awaited them. Eleanor worked with local German authorities to trace surviving family members, reuniting children with aunts, uncles, grandparents when possible. Each reunion was bittersweet. Joy at finding family, sadness at losing daily contact with the children she had come to love. Anna's grandmother was found living in a village near Frankfurt. The old woman had been searching for Anna since the bombing, had walked from town to town asking if anyone had seen a little girl with blonde braids and a gap-toothed smile. When Eleanor brought Anna to meet her, the reunion was overwhelming. The grandmother wept, clutching Anna to her chest, thanking Eleanor over and over in German. Anna clung to her grandmother but kept looking back at Eleanor. Torn between two loves, Eleanor knelt down and spoke gently to Anna, telling her it was okay, that her grandmother would take good care of her, that Eleanor would visit when she could. Anna threw her arms around Eleanor's neck, crying, saying words in German that Eleanor didn't fully understand but felt in her heart. "Mother, thank you. Don't forget me." Eleanor promised she never would, and she kept that promise, writing letters to Anna for years afterward, maintaining a connection across oceans and time. Not all stories ended so, hopefully. Some children had no living relatives, no one to claim them, no clear path forward. These were the hardest cases, the ones that kept the nurses and soldiers awake at night. What would happen to them? Would they end up in institutions, raised by the state, forever marked by abandonment? The Americans did their best, but they couldn't save everyone. Spring came, bringing warmth and the first signs of renewal. Flowers pushed through the rubble, small defiant bursts of color against the gray devastation. Children played in the streets, their laughter becoming more common, more genuine. The orphanages gradually emptied as children were placed with families or moved to more permanent facilities. The temporary camps began to close, their mission accomplished or at least transferred to other organizations. Walker's adoption request for Emil was finally approved in late April. The news came through official channels, pages of documentation and legal language. But the meaning was simple. Emil could come to America, could become Walker's legal son, could have a future. When Walker told him, Emil didn't quite understand at first. Then comprehension dawned, and he launched himself at Walker, hugging him with all his strength, repeating one word over and over: "Father, father, father." The other children celebrated Emil's good fortune, though some felt envious, wondering why no one wanted them. Walker felt the weight of their gazes, wished he could help them all, but knew his limits. He could only do what he could do. Morrison pulled him aside later and told him not to feel guilty, that saving one child was still saving the world for that child. But Walker's unit received orders to rotate home in June, which meant leaving before all the adoption paperwork could be finalized. Emil would have to stay behind temporarily, living in an orphanage run by a charitable organization until the legal process completed and he could travel to America. The thought of separation was agonizing for both of them. The day Walker's unit prepared to depart, Emil clung to him, refusing to let go. Walker had to pry the boy's fingers from his uniform, had to look into those terrified eyes and promise that he would come back, that this wasn't forever, that they were family now and family didn't abandon each other. He gave Emil his dog tags to keep, a tangible reminder of his promise. Emil stood at the fence as the convoy of trucks pulled away, holding the dog tags so tightly that they left imprints in his palm. Walker watched through the back window until Emil was just a small figure in the distance, then just a memory. The ride to the port was silent, each soldier lost in his own thoughts, leaving behind pieces of their hearts in the ruins of Germany. Morrison faced a similar departure. Carl had no relatives who could be found, and Morrison's adoption request had been denied due to his unmarried status and the fact that he was career military with no stable home to offer. The best he could do was ensure Carl was placed in a good orphanage, one run by people Morrison trusted. He promised to write, to send money, to help however he could. Carl accepted this with the stoic resignation of someone who had learned not to expect much from life. But Morrison kept his promises. He wrote to Carl every week, long letters full of news and encouragement. He sent packages with clothes, books, small gifts. He corresponded with the orphanage directors, making sure Carl was well treated, that he continued his education, and he sent money, enough to ensure Carl would have opportunities when he came of age. Eleanor and Sarah faced their own goodbyes. They had extended their service commitments, staying in Germany longer than originally planned, but eventually they too had to return home. The farewells with the children were heartbreaking. So many small arms wrapped around them, so many tears shed, so many promises to write and remember, and never forget. The nurses left behind well-organized systems, trained local staff, established programs that would continue without them. But they also left behind relationships that had changed them fundamentally. They had arrived in Germany expecting to hate these people, and instead had found humanity in its most vulnerable form. They returned to America different women, carrying the faces of the children in their memories, the weight of their stories in their hearts. The years passed. Walker returned to Texas and civilian life, working at his father's hardware store, living in a small apartment, waiting. The adoption process dragged on, slowed by bureaucracy and post-war chaos. He wrote to Emil every week, sent photographs of Texas, described the life they would build together. Emil's replies came less frequently, limited by the orphanage's resources, but each letter was treasured, read and reread until the paper wore thin. In 1948, nearly 3 years after they had met, Emil finally arrived in America. Walker waited at the dock in New York, watching passengers disembark, searching for the boy among the crowd. When he finally spotted Emil, now 15 and taller but still recognizably himself, Walker's throat closed with emotion. Emil saw him at the same moment and ran, pushing through the crowd, dropping his small suitcase in his haste. They collided in an embrace that felt like coming home. Emil was crying and laughing simultaneously, speaking in rapid German mixed with English, trying to express 3 years of longing and fear and hope all at once. Walker just held him, unable to speak, finally allowing himself to believe this was real. His son was here. They were together. They were family. They traveled to Texas by train, Emil pressing his face to the window, amazed by the vast landscape, the open spaces, the absence of ruins. America seemed impossibly clean, impossibly whole, impossibly peaceful. When they arrived at the small town Walker called home, the whole community came out to meet them. Walker's mother embraced Emil first, the boy who had become her grandson through letters and photographs, now real and solid in her arms. Emil struggled at first with language, with culture, with memories that still haunted him. There were nights when he woke screaming from nightmares about bombs and fire. There were moments when he flinched from loud noises or unexpected movements. Walker was patient, helping Emil adjust, getting him counseling from a local doctor who had treated other traumatized veterans and understood that war damaged children just as much as soldiers. Slowly, Emil healed. He enrolled in high school, made friends, learned to play baseball properly. He kept his German accent, but gained American expressions and mannerisms. He called Walker father and Walker's parents grandmother and grandfather, and no one questioned the legitimacy of these titles. Blood didn't make family. Love did. Morrison maintained his correspondence with Carl, and when the boy turned 18, Morrison arranged for him to come to America as well, sponsoring him for immigration and helping him enroll in college. Carl studied engineering, graduated with honors, and eventually got a job with an aeronautics company. He visited Morrison regularly, and though he never officially called him father, the relationship was unmistakably filial. Eleanor returned to Pennsylvania and resumed her life, but she was changed. She volunteered with refugee organizations, helping displaced persons from various conflicts resettle in America. She maintained correspondence with many of the children she had cared for in Germany, watching from across the ocean as they grew up, married, had children of their own. Anna sent her a wedding invitation in 1958, and Eleanor traveled to Germany to attend, an honored guest at the celebration. Sarah became a nursing instructor, training a new generation of caregivers, always emphasizing the importance of seeing patients as whole people, not just bodies to be fixed. She told stories about her time in Germany, about the children who had taught her what strength really meant, what resilience looked like. Her students went on to serve in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond, carrying with them the lessons Sarah had learned in the ruins. The decades rolled on. The world changed. Germany rebuilt, transformed from devastated enemy to trusted ally. The Cold War drew new boundaries, created new conflicts, but the bonds formed in those desperate post-war years endured. Emil grew up, graduated from high school, then college. He became a teacher, specializing in working with immigrant children, understanding their struggles in ways most educators could not. He married, had children of his own, and raised them with stories about the father who had saved him, who had seen past hatred to find love. Walker lived long enough to hold his grandchildren, to see Emil succeed, to know that his decision to help a starving boy had rippled forward into generations. The letters between Emil and Walker's family in Texas continued even after Walker passed away in 1972. Emil visited the grave regularly when he came to America, standing in the Texas sun, remembering a cold German winter and a young soldier who had offered him bread and hope. He brought his children to meet their grandfather's grave, to understand the story of how their family came to be. Carl became a successful engineer, worked on the Apollo program, contributed to the technological advancement that eventually took humanity to the moon. He never forgot the orphanage, the hunger, the fear, or the American lieutenant who had shown him a different path. When Morrison died in 1983, Carl traveled across the country for the funeral, delivering a eulogy that reduced everyone to tears, speaking about the man who had taught him that strength meant kindness, that real courage was choosing mercy over vengeance. In 1989, the world watched as the Berlin Wall fell. The Cold War ended, Germany reunified, and a new era began. Emil, now 57 years old and gray-haired, decided to make a pilgrimage. He returned to Germany for the first time since leaving as a teenager, walking through streets that had been rebuilt into something almost unrecognizable. He visited the site where the orphanage had stood, now occupied by modern apartments. He also searched for James Walker's grave in the military cemetery, wanting to honor the man who had been so much more than a soldier to so many. But then he learned something that made his heart skip. James Walker wasn't dead. Emil had mixed up the dates, confused by time and memory. Walker was alive, living in a nursing home in Texas, 82 years old and in declining health. Emil canceled the rest of his trip and flew immediately to Texas. The nursing home was clean and well-maintained, full of elderly veterans spending their final years in comfort. The receptionist directed him to a sun-filled common room where residents sat in wheelchairs and armchairs, some watching television, others dozing in the afternoon warmth. He found Walker by the window, thinner and frailer than Emil remembered, his hair completely white, his hands spotted with age. But when Emil approached and spoke his name, Walker's eyes focused, cleared, and recognition dawned like sunrise. "Emil?" His voice was rough, uncertain, as if he couldn't quite trust what he was seeing. "Yes, father. It's me." Walker struggled to stand, and Emil rushed forward to help him, to embrace him, to feel the solid reality of this man who had saved his life so many years ago. They held each other, two old men now, one who had been a young soldier and one who had been a starving child, both of them crying without shame. They sat together for hours, Walker in his chair and Emil pulled close beside him, talking about everything and nothing. They spoke about Texas and Germany, about families and losses, about the war and what came after. Walker's memory was spotty, fading in and out like a radio signal, but he remembered Emil, remembered the hunger in the boy's eyes, remembered choosing mercy over hatred. Emil told him about his life, about his children and grandchildren, about his career helping other displaced children find their way. He told Walker that everything good in his life traced back to that moment in the camp when a soldier had offered him food and kindness. He told him that he had tried to pass that kindness forward, to honor the gift he had been given. Walker listened, patting Emil's hand, smiling through tears. He said he had just been doing what seemed right, what his own parents had taught him about treating people with dignity. But Emil shook his head. What Walker had done was more than right. It was extraordinary. It was life-saving. It was love in action. They spent that week together, Emil visiting every day, bringing photographs of his family, sharing meals, sitting in comfortable silence when words weren't necessary. Other residents and staff members noticed the reunion, heard fragments of the story, and words spread through the nursing home. People came to shake Walker's hand, to hear about the soldier who had saved an enemy child, to witness this testament to human goodness. On Emil's last day before returning to Germany, he sat with Walker in the garden, watching the sun set over the Texas landscape. Walker was tired, ready to sleep, but he held Emil's hand and said clearly, with more strength than he had shown all week, "I'm proud of you, son. So proud." Emil couldn't speak through his tears, could only nod and squeeze Walker's hand in return. They sat together until the nurses came to take Walker inside, and Emil watched him go, knowing this was likely the last time they would see each other in this life, but grateful beyond words for this final gift of time together. Walker passed away 3 months later. Emil returned for the funeral, standing beside Walker's children and grandchildren, accepted as family without question. He delivered a eulogy that explained how a young American soldier had changed the course of his entire life, how an act of simple compassion had echoed through decades, how the legacy of that kindness would continue through all the children Emil had helped in his own career. The story didn't end there. Emil's children continued teaching the story to their children, ensuring that the memory of James Walker lived on. Carl's grandchildren learned about Lieutenant Morrison and the importance of seeing humanity even in enemies. Anna's descendants heard about the nurse who had brought her back from silence, the Red Cross women and chaplains and ordinary soldiers who had chosen kindness over cruelty, became legends in the families they had touched. These stories matter because they remind us of a simple truth. Even in the darkest moments, even after the worst atrocities, even when hatred seems to have won, there is still space for compassion. There is still room for mercy. There is still the possibility of redemption, The German children who called American soldiers father and nurses mother were not naive. They understood what had happened, what their nation had done, what had been done to them in return. But they also understood that the future didn't have to be defined by the past, that cycles of hatred could be broken, that healing was possible even when it seemed impossible. The soldiers and nurses who extended compassion to former enemies were not saints. They were ordinary people who made extraordinary choices in difficult circumstances. They were tired, grieving, often angry at what the war had cost them. But they chose to see children as children, regardless of nationality or ideology. They chose humanity over hatred, mercy over vengeance, love over fear. In the ruins of post-war Germany, among the rubble and ash, something remarkable grew. Not just buildings and economies, though those too were rebuilt, but something deeper, something that mattered more. Relationships across impossible divides. Families formed from nothing but need and compassion, the connections that proved stronger than the forces that had tried to tear the world apart. The children who once wandered through bombed-out cities, wearing tattered uniforms and carrying the weight of lost childhoods, grew into adults who built lives defined not by what had been done to them, but by what they chose to do with what they had been given. They became teachers, engineers, nurses, parents. They passed on the lessons they had learned, the kindness they had received, the understanding that even in the aftermath of horror, human connection remained possible. The soldiers and nurses who served in post-war Germany carried those experiences for the rest of their lives. Some struggled with what they had seen, with the moral complexity of helping those who had so recently been enemies, but most felt that what they had done mattered, that their small acts of kindness had made a difference, that they had participated in something larger than military victory. They had participated in healing. In the ashes of war, they built a family, not by blood, not by nation, not by shared history or common language, but by mercy, by choosing, in small moments and large, to extend compassion when it would have been easier to extend cruelty, by recognizing that the children standing before them, whatever uniform they wore or language they spoke, were children first and foremost, by understanding that the only way to end the cycle of hatred was to refuse to participate in it. This is not a story about forgetting or excusing what happened during the war. The atrocities were real. The suffering was immense. The guilt was heavy and deserved. But it is a story about what came after, about how human beings can choose differently, can build bridges across chasms of hatred, can create connection where there should have been only division. In the end, that's what matters most. Not the wars we fight or the enemies we defeat, but the choices we make when the fighting stops. The choice to feed a hungry child, the choice to comfort a frightened orphan, the choice to see a human being instead of an enemy, the choice to become family when family had been destroyed. These choices changed lives, they changed nations, they changed history, and they remind us that even in our darkest hours, we still have the power to choose love, to choose mercy, to choose to be someone's father, someone's mother, someone's hope when hope seems lost. That is the legacy of the children who called American soldiers father and the nurses mother. That is the story that deserves to be remembered, not as a tale of easy redemption or simple forgiveness, but as a testament to the stubborn persistence of human compassion, even in the face of overwhelming darkness. In the ruins, they found each other. In the hunger, they shared bread. In the aftermath of hatred, they chose love. And that choice echoed through generations, rippling forward into futures that no one could have predicted, changing the world one small act of kindness at a time.